Example of kinetic friction. Roll a football. Swipe on a smart tab. Use an ink rubber to erase. Roller skates. Swimming. Combing hair. Cleaning with a vacuum cleaner. Swipe a card. Brakes applied on wheels. Blood experiences kinetic friction. Stir a liquid in a container. Scratch your skin. Drying hands with a napkin. Wear a coat. Type on a laptop. Solving a Megaminx cube. Open a window. Ride a bike. Calligraphy writing. Mouse on a mouse pad. Opening the drawer of the table. Stamping. Roll a football. Playing football gives pleasure to people, and it is an example of kinetic friction. But how does it roll when we kick it? It happens due to the rolling motion of kinetic friction. When we apply force to football, it overcomes static friction, and a movement occurs in football. Swipe on a smart tab. Smart tab is a modern-age device used to access information. We can scroll on a tab with the help of kinetic friction. It occurs between our fingers and screen, which overcomes static friction and makes scrolling easy. Hence it is an example of kinetic friction. Use an ink rubber to erase. Sometimes we make mistakes while writing with a pen. At that time, an ink eraser comes to the rescue. The phenomenon of kinetic friction between the eraser and the surface of the paper is caused by rubbing against each other. Roller skates. Roller skating is a fun game to play and is an example of kinetic friction. The rolling movement is due to kinetic friction. Here the rolling motion of kinetic friction comes into action between wheels and the ground, making the movement easy by overcoming static friction. Swimming. Swimmers usually experience a drag/opposing force called kinetic friction while swimming, but they overcome it and move further. Here, kinetic friction occurs between the skin of the swimmer and the surface of the water. Combing hair. After having a bad hair day, it is difficult to comb our hair, and combing hair is an excellent example of kinetic friction. While combing, we usually experience an opposing force. In this case, kinetic friction opposes comb movement through our hair. Cleaning with a vacuum cleaner. The vacuum cleaner is helpful to clean each corner of the house. This cleaning is possible with the help of kinetic friction between dust particles attached to the surface and the vacuum tube. Hence it is an example of kinetic friction. Swipe a card. Swiping a card while paying a bill is an example of kinetic friction. Swiping is possible due to the sliding motion of kinetic friction. Likewise, when you swipe a card in a machine, sliding occurs due to kinetic friction between the card's surface and the machine. Brakes applied on wheels. Applying brakes in a vehicle is an example of kinetic friction. When you apply a brake, the kinetic friction of force opposes the movement, generating heat between the parts, reducing the velocity, and making the vehicle stop. Blood experiences kinetic friction. The flowing of blood in arteries is an example of kinetic friction. The blood which passes through our nerve experiences kinetic friction. The flow is possible when kinetic friction overcomes static friction. If it fails to flow, it may block the heart, resulting in a heart attack. Stir a liquid in a container. Stirring a liquid is possible due to kinetic friction. The opposing friction, called kinetic friction, is responsible for movement produced by the spoon when inserted into the static liquid. This opposing force gives stirring movement to the liquid. Scratch your skin. Due to itching, we scratch our skin. Scratching is also an example of kinetic friction. It occurs due to the rubbing motion between the surface of our nails and the layer of the skin. Drying hands with a napkin. We use a napkin to dry our hands. It is an example of kinetic friction. When you use a napkin, a rubbing movement occurs and kinetic friction occurs, which is an opposing force between surfaces of hand and napkin and results in drying. Wear a coat. Wearing a coat is a real-life example of kinetic friction. For example, while wearing a coat, we experience some opposing force that resists our hand from inserting our hand, and this resistance is by kinetic friction. Type on a laptop. Typing on a laptop is also an excellent example of kinetic friction. Kinetic friction acts between the tip of our fingers and the keys, and while we type, we experience an opposing force due to kinetic friction. Solving a Megaminx cube. Solving a Rubik's/Megaminx cube is a tricky task, and the resisting force we experience while solving is due to kinetic friction. Likewise, the opposing force developed while moving the cube is due to kinetic friction. Open a window. Opening a window is an example of kinetic friction. To open a window initially at rest, we have to apply some force to overcome static friction. However, applying sufficient opposing force called kinetic friction makes it possible to slide the window. Ride a bike. Riding a bike is possible only because of kinetic friction. Although the wheels of the bike experience an opposing force from the ground, which makes them move further, the kinetic friction helps the bike move. Calligraphy writing. Calligraphy writing is an example of kinetic friction. Although in calligraphy writing, the movement between pen tip and paper is essential, this movement is made smooth by overcoming static friction with the help of kinetic friction and is responsible for creating beautiful handwriting. Mouse on a mousepad. We use a mouse device to move the cursor on a desktop computer. The movement between mouse and mousepad is possible due to kinetic friction, and hence it is an example of kinetic friction. Opening the drawer of the table. The sliding of a drawer in a dressing table is because of kinetic friction. Initially, when the drawer is closed, a static force acts on it, but we overcome static friction by applying more force. Then, kinetic friction comes into action, making movement easy. Stamping. Stamping of ink is an example of kinetic friction. Again, we use a seal and dip it in an ink pad. Here, static friction between seal and ink becomes kinetic friction, making the seal imprint on a sheet of paper. FAQs on kinetic friction. What is kinetic friction? Kinetic friction is a contact force that occurs when there is a movement between two objects. It is a type of friction also called dynamic friction, which occurs between two bodies when they move or rub against each other. What are the types of movement in kinetic friction? There are two types of movement in kinetic friction are as follows. Sliding motion, rolling motion. What are the laws of kinetic friction? The three laws of kinetic friction are as follows. First law. Kinetic friction is proportional to normal friction. Second law. Kinetic friction does not depend on the area and shape of surfaces in contact. Third law. It depends on the nature and material of bodies in contact. What changes the strength of kinetic friction? The nature of surfaces changes the strength of kinetic friction. If the surface is rough, the object experiences very high friction, and if the surface is smooth, the object experiences less friction. What happens if there is kinetic friction? If kinetic friction occurs, then there is the absence of static friction. Kinetic friction occurs when two objects are in motion. It occurs in the opposite direction of the moving object and requires more force to overcome static friction. Is kinetic friction a self-adjusting force? In general, kinetic friction cannot be a self-adjusting force. It happens because, after some time, static friction becomes sliding friction which makes an object move. Please visit our website lambdageeks.com for more articles on technology, engineering, mathematics, and various other domains. scientific calculator, and many more other tools.